Good afternoon. I'm sorry I wasn't able to join you today, but I want to thank OECD and UCLG for asking me to provide some comments on this important initiative. We simply don't know enough about subnational finance, and the World Observatory has made genuine advances on this increasingly significant aspect of public finance. We know from the work of the Observatory that subnational government public investment can be significant, but that it varies considerably. A few trends are there. For example, it tends to be lower in unitary and lower income countries, and in Africa compared to other regions. We also know from the work of the Observatory that subnational government debt, a primary source of development finance, is limited and unevenly distributed across countries. It is, for example, weaker in lower and middle income countries and in the Africa region. And even within countries, there is some unevenness. Some countries make good use of it, but many do not. The overall assessment is that there is a need to improve the scope of subnational government public investment and subnational government access to debt financing in many countries. The limited situation on this front represents a missed opportunity. We know that if conditions are right or can be developed, that subnational governments have the potential to play a very productive role in many types of public investments. Subnational governments can also be in a better position to think more holistically about integrated territorial development planning than fragmented national agencies undertaking local investments. In addition, accountability linkages to citizens are likely to be more robust at the subnational level. Now, the other thing we have to recognize is that subnational government investment in debt policies are not enough. Many of the recommended policies and efforts to deal with inadequate subnational government public investment have focused on technical reforms and mechanisms. These would include, for example, improving subnational government access to financial markets and other sources of development finance. Another is developing opportunities for subnational government public-private partnerships that expand options for subnational government investment. In addition, providing subnational government access to resources from international financial institutions and major global funds targeted to specific purposes, such as climate change, is also commonly recommended. But the problem is that these policies aren't going to work unless there are other things going on. They're relatively narrowly constructed innovations, and their success is going to depend on building or improving other pillars of effective subnational government. We know, for example, and we see this from the work of the World Observatory, that an inadequately structured intergovernmental system that doesn't provide sufficient clarity on subnational government roles and obligations, that doesn't create mechanisms and incentives for effective and responsible subnational government behavior, including sound and transparent subnational government financial and asset management, and reasonable connectivity to subnational government constituents, is not likely to be very effective. In addition, there's a need for sufficient subnational government revenue powers and entitlements. This includes, of course, own source revenues, fees, taxes, as well as shared national government revenues through various forms of shared taxes and intergovernmental fiscal transfers. Now, we know from the detailed work of the Observatory and other sources that there are many challenges and deficiencies on these fronts. For example, there's a lack of clarity on subnational government functions, both in terms of the legal framework and in terms of practice. There are weak linkages between development planning and budgeting, which leads both to unfunded development projects and inadequate recurrent resources for operation and maintenance of implemented investments. There's also insufficient autonomous subnational government revenues in many countries, and these are needed to allow subnational governments to meet their responsibilities. And I think it's fair to say that there are, in many countries, inadequately resourced and improperly allocated intergovernmental transfers, which create funding and incentive challenges for subnational governments. So the bottom line is that without sufficient attention to strengthening the overall intergovernmental fiscal systems, the benefits of reform dedicated to improve subnational government access to development finance cannot be adequately realized. A final thing that I think it's really important to get on the table, and some of this comes out in the work of the Observatory, is that it's essential to recognize that countries are very diverse. And in addition to that, not all reforms can be undertaken at the same time, especially in places with weaker institutional environments. Countries have very different intergovernmental systems, often with multiple layers of subnational government that have different relationships. Some of them are more independent, some of them are more hierarchical. And there are often issues of jurisdictional fragmentation, particularly in large urban areas, which can impede effective area-wide public investment planning. These differences and challenges have to be recognized and taken into account in designing and implementing reforms and undertaking subnational government investment. And finally, given the scope and complexity of subnational government reforms and the different starting points across and even within countries, it's essential to be strategic about approaching intergovernmental fiscal reforms for this purpose. They need to be realistic and properly sequenced. They need to have well-conceived capacity development. This type of an approach lays the foundation for a broader program of reforms over an appropriate period of time. It will be difficult to achieve advanced reforms in subnational government development finance if some basics do not exist and are not being given sufficient attention. So the bottom line on this set of issues is that paying adequate attention to the diversity of conditions and capacities, suggesting a possible need for asymmetric treatment of subnational governments even within countries, and developing a pragmatic strategy for improving subnational government investment and the system underlying it are really essential to improve on the status quo. I think I'm going to leave it at that. I'm sure that others will add to or maybe disagree with some of these points, but I want to thank you for listening, and I wish you productive discussions and a successful conference. Thank you.